Almost 39 years ago, a series of explosions ripped through the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat, just 65 miles from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. The explosions released an estimated 50 to 185 million curies of radioactive particles, contaminating vast areas of Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and parts of Europe. Millions of people were exposed to radiation, with nearly 404,000 people resettled from contaminated areas. The incident is considered the worst nuclear disaster in history and one of the most serious stains on the legacy of the Soviet Union. However, the Russian Navy could be flirting with catastrophe again, potentially comparable to or even worse than Chernobyl. It involves nuclear-powered warships and, in particular, the Admiral Nakhimov. The seaworthiness of this class of vessels, or rather the possible lack thereof, along with their highly volatile power supply, has led them to being dubbed floating Chernobyls over the years. The renewed concerns are based on an updated version of the Admiral Nakhimov that is again taken to the waves. The Nakhimov has been touted as a new kind of Russian superweapon and is set to become the flagship vessel of the Russian fleet, but questions remain about its safety, its potency, and the specter of a Chernobyl-type disaster waiting to happen. Let's take a closer look at the Admiral Nakhimov and why its return to action matters. For the first time since 1997, the Russian Navy's nuclear-powered battlecruiser Admiral Nakhimov is back on the water and moving under its own power, after years of repair work and modernization, 28 years to be exact. The 28,000-ton battlecruiser's two nuclear reactors went back online earlier in 2025, and the warship is expected to become the future flagship of the Russian fleet, superseding its sister vessel, Pyotr Veliki or Peter the Great. The two warships are the only two survivors of the Kirov class of nuclear-powered guided missile-heavy cruisers of the Soviet and Russian navies, known in Russia as Project 1144 Orlan class. They remain the largest and heaviest surface combatant warships in active operation in the world, if not the most effective. Among all classes of modern warships, they are second in size only to large aircraft carriers, and their appearance in 1979 was a key consideration in the US Navy recommissioning the Iowa-class battleships in the 1980s. But it's fair to say the class never really lived up to its potential. The original commission was for 5 ships, 4 were ultimately built, along with the disastrous SSV-33 Ural command, control and spy ship, which used the Kirov-class hull design but with a modified superstructure and different armament. We'll explain why the SSV-33 Ural earned the disastrous title a little bit later. The lead ship of the class, Kirov, was laid down in March 1974 at Leningrad's Baltysky Naval Shipyard, then launched and commissioned in December 1980. When the ship appeared for the first time, NATO observers called it Balcom 1, short for Baltic Combatant 1. But Kirov suffered a reactor accident in 1990 in the Mediterranean Sea during her second deployment. Repairs were never carried out due to a lack of funds and the chaotic political situation in the Soviet Union in the 1990s. It was placed in reserve and renamed Admiral Ushakov in 1992. After originally being written off in 2010, the Russian Navy announced plans to restore and reactivate all of its Kirov-class ships, potentially giving the revamped Admiral Ushakov a new lease on life. However, just 2 years later, it was reported to be beyond repair, and in 2021, the Admiral Ushakov was scrapped. The second Kirov-class ship, Admiral Lazarev, was finally commissioned in 1984. It was originally named Frunze, but was renamed at the same time as Kirov became Admiral Ushakov. The ship became inactive just a decade later, in 1994, was decommissioned in 1999, and sent for scrapping in 2021, which is scheduled for completion by the end of 2025. In the case of both, the Admiral Ushakov and the Admiral Lazarev, the reactor cores were in such a dire state that the Russians decided it would be too difficult, expensive, and potentially dangerous to remove the spent nuclear fuel and repair them. Which brings us to the third Kirov-class ship to be commissioned, the Admiral Nakhimov. It was originally named the Kalinin when it was commissioned in 1988, then renamed at the same time as the others in 1992. After many delays and setbacks, the fourth Kirov-class ship, Yuri Andropov, followed a decade later in 1998, 12 years after construction started. It became the Pyotr Veliki in 1992, and as mentioned earlier, still operates as the flagship vessel of Russia's Northern Fleet. The fifth and final Kirov-class ship was originally going to be named Fleet Admiral of the Soviet Union Kuznetsov, or Dzerzhinsky, which was later changed to October Revolution and then just Kuznetsov. Ultimately, it made no difference because, in part due to the delays experienced during the building of Pyotr Veliki, the ship, and indeed the entire project, was scrapped in 1990. But not before the ill-fated SSV-33 Ural super spy ship, built on Kirov-class foundations, had been built. It's not clear whether the ship's misfortunes ultimately came down to poor design and manufacture, or more fancifully, somehow incurring the wrath of a pantheon of sea gods. But if any ship was a floating Chernobyl waiting to happen, this was it. And just like the newly relaunched Admiral Nakhimov today, the Ural was intended to give Russia a high-tech edge at sea. The idea was to build a huge nuclear-powered reconnaissance ship specifically designed to sail thousands of miles to the US missile test site at Kwajalein Atoll in the remotest part of the Pacific Ocean. It would sit there for months on end, scooping up electronic data to help the Russians figure out what the US's most secretive weapons do. Construction began in 1989, and the Ural was ready to make its maiden voyage from the Baltic shipyard where it was built to its port home of Vladivostok just less than 2 years later. Almost 900 feet long, 100 feet across at her widest part, and displacing 34,640 tons of water, Ural was unquestionably huge. It took a crew of 1,000 to staff it. Its twin nuclear reactors could, in theory, generate 171 megawatts, as much as a small civilian power plant. All that juice was meant to propel the ship to a speed of 22 knots while powering one of the densest, most complex arrays of radars, radios, and electronic listening devices ever put to sea. However, the Ural never made it anywhere near Kwajalein, or anywhere that its expansive array of tech could be put to its intended use. Soviet and later Russian authorities, thankfully, were never willing to risk sending Ural on an actual deployment, and maybe that's a good thing. The ship was a magnet for disasters at sea from the moment it entered service in December 1988. The issues started almost from the outlet. When the Ural finally arrived at Vladivostok, after a round trip all the way around Europe and through Southeast Asia, the vessel's special pier wasn't complete. It was forced to anchor out in the bay and begin a long battle with corrosion and failing machinery, which had to remain running while at anchor to power the systems supporting the huge crew. Then in the summer of 1990, a fire broke out on the ship, damaging large parts of it. Later in the fall of 1991, a powerful storm tore the still scorched ship loose from its moorings and swept it out to sea, nearly dashing it, along with its reactors, against a rocky islet. The following year, the still incapacitated Ural was pierside in Vladivostok when an ammo depot just a mile away accidentally exploded, peppering the naval base and docked ships with rounds and shrapnel. The crew somehow managed to move the ship out of range, with only the help of one tug and her own power, another narrow nuclear escape. By that time, the Soviet Union had collapsed, taking Russia's shipbuilding industry with it. The Kremlin couldn't afford to pay for even routine training and deployments, let alone the many millions of dollars in repairs that the Ural required. As the ship wasted away in Vladivostok, it gradually took on water and began listing 5 degrees, a problem that several repair efforts could not correct. To keep it from breaking free in another storm, dock workers eventually took the extreme step of physically welding the giant ship to the pier. In addition to being a nuclear accident waiting to happen, the Ural was also a rough place to be stationed. Something, probably radiation, had killed all the rats on board so quickly during the maiden voyage that they didn't even have time to jump ship. However, many of the crew who were exposed to whatever killed the rats did. After a year or two of uncomfortable, dangerous, and entirely prospectless service on the hapless ship, and in response to denied transfer requests, many crew members simply jumped overboard and swam ashore. Ural's crew dwindled to just 100 sailors, 10% of her original complement, which hastened her slide into utter decrepitude. In 2002, the Russian Navy formally decommissioned Ural and spent nearly the next decade figuring out how to dispose of the ship. They didn't want to expose any of the many military secrets on board. Eventually, in 2010, it was sent to the Far East Zvejda shipyard for dismantling, which was completed by 2018. So that was at least one potential Russian nuclear disaster at sea the world no longer had to worry about. But it's far from the only one. Almost most of the others now lie on the ocean floor. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union built more than 400 nuclear-powered submarines. Situated just 60 miles from the border of NATO member Norway, the Arctic port of Murmansk and surrounding military bases became the home base of the USSR's nuclear navy and icebreakers, and of course their highly radioactive spent fuel. It was only after the Iron Curtain fell that the consequences became clear. At Andreyeva Bay, where 661,000 tons of toxic water leaked into the Barents Sea from a nuclear storage pool in 1982, the spent fuel from more than 100 submarines was partly kept in rusty canisters under the open sky. Fearing contamination, Russia joined Western countries in a sweeping cleanup to decommission and dismantle 197 Soviet nuclear submarines, dispose of strontium batteries from 1,000 navigation beacons, and remove fuel and waste from Andreyeva Bay and 3 other dangerous coastal sites. It's a good start, but there's still plenty more Russian nuclear mess on the ocean floors that still need to be cleaned up. A 2019 feasibility study by an international nuclear safety consortium found 18,000 radioactive objects in the Arctic Ocean, including 19 vessels and 14 reactors. While the radiation given off by most of these objects has neared background levels thanks to silt built up over time, the study found that 1,000 of them still have elevated levels of penetrating gamma radiation. Meanwhile, 90% of that is contained in 6 Russian objects, 2 nuclear submarines and 3 nuclear submarine reactor compartments, and the reactor compartment of the icebreaker Lenin, all of which sank. One of them is the K-27, once known as the Golden Fish because of its high cost. The 360-foot-long attack submarine's experimental liquid-cooled reactors were a serious problem right from its launch. One of them ruptured and exposed 9 sailors to fatal doses of radiation. Eventually, the Navy filled the reactor with asphalt and scuttled it east of Novaya Zemlya Island in a mere 108 feet of water. The K-27 was sunk after some safety measures had been installed, designed to keep the wreck from rupturing until 2032. Unfortunately, that's not the case with the K-159. This 350-foot-long November-class attack submarine sank without warning, sending 1,760 pounds of spent uranium fuel to the sea floor beneath busy fishing and shipping lanes just north of Murmansk. Thomas Nilsson, editor of the Barents Observer online newspaper, described the submarines as a Chernobyl in slow motion on the seabed. Russian state nuclear corporation Rosatom intends to raise these wrecks before 2035, as it's done with the top-of-the-line attack submarine Kursk, which infamously sank with its 118 crew in August 2000. However, no such sweeping nuclear cleanup has ever been undertaken at sea, let alone in icy, turbulent waters like the Barents Sea. The potential for disaster remains high. Meanwhile, far from hitting the pause button on its naval nuclear aspirations, Russia has doubled down. It's pushing on with the construction of nuclear-powered icebreakers for use in the Arctic region, and in 2010 it launched another vessel which was quickly labeled as the next floating Chernobyl, the Akademik Lomonosov. This is literally a floating nuclear power plant, a non-self-propelled 21,500-ton barge with 2 modified KLT-40S nuclear icebreaker-type reactors, producing 35 by 2 MW electric or 150 by 2 MW thermal power. In September 2019, it arrived at its permanent location in the Chukotka district, where it provides some 60% of the power for the region. However, during the hazardous 5,400-mile trip through the Arctic from St. Petersburg, where it was built, alarm bells were ringing loudly about the potential for disaster. Now, similar concerns are being expressed about the Admiral Nakhimov. Could this massive ship, due to become the flagship vessel in the Russian Navy, be another Ural? To be fair, during its almost 3 decades of undergoing repairs and modernization, it's received some serious upgrades in both offensive and safety features. The ship is capable of achieving speeds of 31 to 32 knots, with virtually unlimited range under nuclear power and endurance of up to 60 days at sea. Crew complements are reported at approximately 710 to 744 personnel, with the capacity to embark an air group of 3 Ka-27, Ka-29 and Ka-31 helicopters. Like with the Ural, details about the exact specs are hush-hush. However, reports specify that 10 universal vertical launchers have been installed, each capable of housing 8 Caliber NK or Onyx cruise missiles. Some accounts also mention the inclusion of Zircon hypersonic missiles. Russian sources have also reported that the final configuration may include up to 176 vertical launch cells, divided between 80 anti-surface and 96 anti-air weapons. That's ambitious. By comparison, China's Type 55 super destroyer has 112 vertical launch system cells. A Flight 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has 96 cells, while a Ticonderoga-class cruiser has 122 cells. The US Navy's Zumwalt-class stealth destroyers currently have 80 cells. Admiral Nakhimov has reportedly received new radar systems and a new main gun. The Soviet-era 130mm AK-130 dual-purpose gun has been replaced with a more modern AK-192M gun in the same caliber. In addition to that firepower, the cruiser received upgraded layered air defense systems such as Fort M and Pantsir M, together with Packet NK and Otvet anti-submarine warfare systems. These improvements add to the existing ability to operate Ka-27 series helicopters from its hangar and flight deck, enabling coordination of long-range anti-submarine operations. Yet questions remain about what weapon systems and other features have actually been installed and how effectively they work. After all, the summer 2025 relaunch of the Admiral Nakhimov came after multiple hiccups and delays. The ship had been laid up in dry dock at the Sevmash shipyard in the port city of Severodvinsk on the White Sea since it last went to sea in 1997, and work on it only really began in earnest in 2014. The initial expectation for completion of the work was around 2018, but the date was repeatedly pushed back, first to 2019 and then to 2020. By 2017, Russian news agency TASS was reporting that work on the Admiral Nakhimov should be completed by 2021. In 2021, reports stated that the warship wouldn't be back in service before 2023, and in 2022 the Sevmash shipyard stated that service re-entry had been pushed back to 2024. Now it's finally ready for sea tests, but do all of these delays mean that a whole bunch of cutting-edge weaponry has been installed, making this a legitimate new Russian naval superweapon of sorts? Or does it mean that there's potential for ongoing Ural-type issues, with the spectre of a nuclear disaster at sea or at port still looming overhead? Time will tell. If it packs all the weaponry that it's purported to, it would certainly be an intimidating naval presence. Then again, as Ukraine has demonstrated in the Black Sea, and to an extent, as the Houthis did in the Red Sea, in the age of attack UAVs, naval drones, and hypersonic missiles, is any ship really secure and defendable anymore? At the very least, the launch of a new Russian nuclear-powered battleship is likely to mean the removal of 2 other potential floating Chernobyls from the waters. In addition to leading the decommissioning of the Pyotr Veliki, the launch of the Admiral Nakhimov has also given Russia the green light to sideline its troubled and long-berthed aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov. Meanwhile, plans for a new class of nuclear-powered super-destroyers to replace the Admiral Kuznetsov have been shelved. Unlike the Admiral Nakhimov, the Pyotr Veliki underwent only a minor modernization and still relies primarily on Soviet-era weapons and sensors. At one time, both battle cruisers were scheduled to undergo the same in-depth rework. However, the status of those plans is now very much uncertain, with several reports indicating that the Russian Navy will retire the Pyotr Veliki altogether. That's one less floating Chernobyl for the world to worry about, which can only be a good thing. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all the most important naval and military news from around the world.